There's a line of dialogue in Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, that I think the younger generation of today really doesn't quite understand. At least that is in the context of which it was meant. And I had a recent revelation of how ironic that is when you look at the landscape of the culture wars in mass media and entertainment today. First, let's take a listen at that line of dialogue so you can know what I'm talking about.
If you're not with me, then you're my enemy.
Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
I'm assuming probably anyone who's watching this has seen Revenge of the Sith already and is familiar with the scene, but just to put it in context, at this point Anakin has fully turned to the dark side, but he's not yet in his Darth Vader suit. This is sort of his last chance to come back to the light. Anakin believes that Obi-Wan has turned Padme against him. Obi-Wan's making his last plea for Anakin to return to the light side, and Anakin makes that comment, "You're either with me or you're my enemy." Now, if you were an adult in 2005, you understood what George Lucas was saying here. He was making a commentary on a kind of right-wing ideology that basically took the idea of moral absolutes. At the time, the left-wing ideology was very much into this idea that morality was more relative, that the world was more gray than white or black. Of course, there were, even in this philosophy, the idea that there was, of course, things that were good and things that were bad, but the idea is that there was much more of this sort of gray area where you can have your ideas, I can have mine, live and let live. Where many on the right took a stand that good and evil, right and wrong were much more clearly defined. So George Lucas here is making a very progressive statement when Obi-Wan replies and says, "Only the Sith deal in absolutes." Because what he's saying is the idea that you simply deal in black and white makes you part of the problem. It's ironic that 15 years ago, the idea of a more complex and deeper perspective on the moral spectrum was a progressive idea, and yet the younger progressives of today hold to an absolute line from which there is no variance. So you may be asking, why am I talking about this? And what does this have to do with Richard C. Myers? You also may be asking, who is Richard C. Myers? Well, I'm assuming at this point anyone who's clicked on the video has some idea who Richard Myers is, or you're just really into Star Wars and anything that has the word Star Wars in it, you click on the video. Fair warning, if the latter, you may be a little disappointed in this video. In either event, let me go ahead and give you a little background on him. So Richard Myers is a comic book fan and YouTuber, and now a comic book writer and publisher. He is highly successful with his campaigns. Right now he publishes exclusively through crowdfunding on Indiegogo. As far as I know, I don't think he hasn't done a Kickstarter in a long time. I don't think he uses any other platforms, but I do know he's big on Indiegogo, and he is one of the most successful comic book creators for someone who's not worked for a large publisher. His projects almost always raise over 100,000, often over 200,000, with his most successful one to date raising over 400,000. So that's really good. If you have no idea what qualifies as good or bad numbers, the average, well, actually, I'm not really for sure what the average Kickstarter or Indiegogo comic campaign makes that is successful. Now, the average one doesn't succeed, but I do know a vast majority of the campaigns are under 10,000. So, needless to say, if your campaigns are routinely in the 6-digit figures, then you are doing extremely well. But Richard Myers did not start as a comic book creator. A couple of years ago, he got really big into YouTube and social media and eventually was able to monetize a channel talking about comic books. And he had one major central thesis, which is the aggressive inclusion of progressive left politics in comic books was ruining the industry. It was destroying the quality of comics, it was chasing away readers, and destroying an industry which he was very fond of. He got a reputation for being very right-leaning from an ideological perspective, although that's not to say he actually would talk about politics, nor would he suggest that right-wing politics should be prominent in comic books. He's simply unapologetic that he doesn't want progressive left politics pushed in the comic books. While he's not the first person to get on YouTube and have these viewpoints and share them, he was the first one, I think, to make a really huge splash. One of the main reasons for that was the result of a very public rivalry he got between himself and Heather Antos, who at the time was one of the editors for Marvel Comics. Richard publicly stated that he thought Heather Antos and several of her female colleagues at Marvel Comics were, quote, fake geek girls, and accused them of being diversity hires, meaning he believed they were not hired on merit, but rather hired to fill a diversity quota. Heather and others that worked with her were quick to push back and went on a very public campaign to label Richard as a sexist, as well as a racist and a right-wing extremist because of his comments about diversity hires. Now, most comic book creators, when they're threatened with such labels, will quickly back down. They will apologize or maybe just go off the radar. A lot of people don't want to have those labels thrown at them and don't want that kind of pressure. But Richard was different. Richard simply pushed back. He did not apologize for any of his perspectives, and he continued to make videos that held to a central thesis. Now, at some point in this rivalry between him and others in the comic book community, some of his detractors made a challenge. They basically said, if you think you can do better, why don't you? The idea being, if Richard was right and the comic books that he wanted to see created would sell better, then why doesn't he just do that and make those kind of comics and see how they sell? Now, in making this challenge, his detractors in the industry anticipated one of two things would happen. Number one, getting a project off the ground would just be too difficult and Richard wouldn't do it, might not even try. Or number two, he would try, but the project wouldn't sell very well. Now, to the latter, they were banking on just how difficult it is to get a project from someone who's never published before to be successful, much less just get off the ground. And realistically, their expectation was correct, that they issued this challenge. There's no way that Richard Meyer should have been able to live up to it. The one thing they didn't take into factor, though, was his YouTube following. And it's understandable that they wouldn't have realized the impact of YouTube, because at that time, you really didn't have this influx of YouTube creators who were creating comic books. In any event, he decided to accept their challenge. Thus, Jawbreakers came about, which was a graphic novel written by him and drawn by John Malin, which became his first Indiegogo crowdfunding campaign. The campaign was an immediate success, raising close to $100,000 in a very short period of time, with still plenty of time left in the campaign to do more. With the initial success of this campaign, he attracted interest from some fellow creators who were able to help him negotiate a deal with a small company in Texas called Antarctic Press to publish his book after it was fully crowdfunded. There was an immediate outcry from Richard Meyer's detractors, who really pushed back on this. It wasn't as much the campaign that bothered them, but the idea that the book would be in stores was too much for many of them. And there was an outcry for Antarctic Press not to carry the book, as well as stores not to stock it, even if Antarctic Press decided to go forward and publish the book. Some stores came out and said that they would not order the book, even saying they would not accept pre-orders if someone wanted to just order it directly through the shop. This generated tension not only between Richard Myers and his detractors, but also between a growing support that Richard had of comic book readers who agreed with him and those same detractors. One of these detractors was a very famous comic book writer, Mark Waid. Mark Waid is one of the most famous comic book writers working in the industry today. He has a career going back decades. Mark Waid reached out to the owner of Antarctic Press and allegedly convinced him not to carry Richard's book, thus ending any chances that Jawbreaker would be in stores anytime soon, that is, and seeming to strike a huge victory against Richard and any other aspiring comic book creators who felt as he did. While the deal with Antarctic Press was canceled and it never came back to light, what happened next is that his Jawbreakers campaign, which was still going on at the time the AP announced they were canceling the book, exploded. As I'd mentioned, it was already around about 100,000 or more about the time that this happened. And it went from there to 200,000 to 300,000 to 400,000 in no time at all, making his campaign one of the most successful that has ever been, doing even better than campaigns by well-established comic book creators and talents who'd already tried to do their own campaigns. So, did Richard Myers really lose this fight? Well, go back and look at his campaigns that he's done since then. Immediately after doing Jawbreakers, he launched another one called Ironsides, which didn't do near as well. It only made like around 150,000. Only, I say sarcastically, because that's still extremely well, even though it was only a fraction of what his Jawbreakers campaign did. In the last 2 years since the Antarctic Press deal was canceled, he's grossed over $1 million making comic books. For someone who just 2 years ago did not have a book to his name at all through any sort of publication means is incredible. So, in the fight between Richard and his detractors, who really won? I would say it's hands down Richard. I mean, maybe he didn't get to realize the dream of a small publisher carrying his book, but I can tell you for a fact, everything he's done through the campaigns, if he'd gotten his book in stores, AP would have been just a drop in the bucket for what he's done since then. So what went wrong? Why were Richard Meyer's detractors not able to silence him or at the very least keep him from being the success? Well, let's get back to Revenge of the Sith. Well, let's go back to Anakin's line. You're either with me or you're my enemy. Obi-Wan's retort, again, was designed to show that absolutism just isn't right. That is, and I can tell you from some first-hand experience, conversations I've had, things I've seen and read, that his detractors did see Richard Myers as a kind of an absolute evil. Now, they might come out and say, oh, we didn't say he, was really like as bad as Hitler, but come on, let's be honest, actually, they really kind of were. The vitriol, the hatred for him was intense. They tried to portray him as this great evil. But the point George Lucas was making is really something I think a lot of people understand, that right and wrong aren't always black and white, that there is a lot of gray in the world. So when you try to make someone an absolute good or an absolute evil, then you're making him to be something that doesn't feel real. And that's where Richard's detractors really lost the game. They viewed him as utter scum, and according to that, they felt no bounds about holding back to how they were going to treat him. Now, when it was just a war of words, I don't think that many people would have cared. If Richard was going to say insulting things about his detractors and they wanted to insult back, it was going to be fair game. But once they got involved in trying to shut his channel down and trying to get Jawbreakers canceled, that changed everything. Now, people who were on the fence about Richard, maybe they didn't like how he said things, or maybe they just really hadn't formed an opinion. Or maybe they didn't really even know that much about him, but suddenly they hear about this Jawbreakers deal getting canceled. Now they're sympathizing with him. Why? Because the outrage has been turned around. Outrage is a powerful force. At the beginning, when it's just Richard saying insulting things, his detractors could have had outrage on their side. Instead, by going on the offensive, they lost that high ground. And that was really the key there. There's another line from Revenge of the Sith, closely related to the scene that we've previously talked about, where Obi-Wan finally defeats Anakin by assuming the high ground. In Revenge of the Sith, it's a literal metaphor. Obi-Wan literally is a higher elevation, but it's still metaphoric because Obi-Wan at that point is pleading with Anakin for their confrontation to not end in violence, but Anakin insists on using violence to end the confrontation, and of course it goes badly for Anakin. Had his detractors taken the high ground, I believe things would have worked out very different for the Jawbreakers campaign and for Richard Meyer's future in comics. I believe he would have still had some success. Why? Well, he put together a product that looked really good, and he was very good at promoting. However, he would not have made the kind of money from the Anarch Press deal that he could have made doing crowdfunding, so I think after doing a volume or two of Jawbreakers, he probably just would have gone strictly with the crowdfunding. But even if he continued to try to put the book in stores, Anarch Press's reach is limited by the fact they are a small publisher. There are a lot of retailers out there that just won't order from small publishers, no matter how cool a book looks. But you take a few hundred or a couple of thousand fans and put that in a crowdfunding campaign, you can make all sorts of crazy money. And that's what he did. And he got so many of those backers because of the outrage generated by Mark Waid and others. Yes, his campaign would have done well regardless. Having John Malin as an artist and having success on his YouTube channel was simply too good a recipe for it to do badly. But he got so many more fans on the outrage, and then what he did next was very smart. What did he do? He took care of his fans. He listened to their feedback, he showed them appreciation, and he's continued to recruit good talent. So many people who would not have been his supporters, had it not been for the miscalculated actions of his detractors, ended up becoming dedicated fans and continue to support his campaigns 2 years later, so that once again, as I'd mentioned, his campaigns continue to draw in six-digit figures almost every time. Now, what would have happened if his detractors had been the ones to take the high ground? And it would have been so easy to do because Richard was insulting in some things he said. Calling someone a fake geek girl and a diversity hire is not the rudest thing you can say to someone, but it's definitely not a kind statement. Had Heather, Mark, and all their supporters responded to this with kindness and professionalism, had they just simply taken the politer stance and risen above all the insults and everything, then they could have actually made Richard look bad. And while I think Jawbreakers would have still been a pretty successful campaign, instead of causing his campaign to explode with success, they might have taken it the other direction, where it would have been just moderately successful. And if you look at his other campaigns, none of his other campaigns has done as well as his first. So if his first campaign was only moderately successful, his other campaigns afterwards might have also been less successful than the first. And over time, maybe over a couple of years, the campaigns would have just sort of run their course and Richard would have moved on to other things. But now the opposite has happened. Richard Myers is not going anywhere. He's going to continue to make comics for many years to come, and he'll continue to make money at it. Good money. So if Richard Myers really is a monster, He's a monster of his enemy's own creation. And had they just taken their cues from Revenge of the Sith, they might have realized this.